we're taking a look at the Rosewill Fusion C40 kit today. This is a 2-in-1 keyboard and mouse combo. You don't get a mouse pad or anything like that. Usually rings in at around $40 US, but lately I've been having a hard time finding this in stock. If I can find some locations for it in stock, I will have those links down in the video's description. Now, as we get started by taking a look at the mouse, I just want to make sure everyone's aware that just because I tend to use higher end components at my personal setup does not mean that I'm weighting these any less fairly than I would be weighting review of any other peripheral that comes across my desk. The main thing to keep in mind here is that we need to have seriously tempered expectations with regard to things like build quality, feature functionality, implementation, things like that. You'd be surprised how much the cost of a product can increase simply by tightening up one or two little tolerances here and there that seem like an innocuous thing otherwise. So we're gonna start off with the mouse then, and again, really no huge surprises here. It's using pretty bog standard plastics on it. It's got some glossy finishes. The build quality is not horrific, it's not offensive, and it actually feels decent in hand. There are some sculpted contours on the side of the mouse for your ring and pinky finger to rest in, and depending on your grip style of choice for this mouse, you may or may not find this comfortable. But as a result, it sort of forces you into one of two very distinct grip patterns for this. You're either going to be holding this mouse in a sort of hybrid-y palm/fingertip grip, or it's going to be a hybrid-y fingertip/claw grip the way you need to hold it. It actually works well here because this mouse lets you know immediately how it is meant to be held. This is assisted by the left side where your thumb rests also being similarly well sculpted and tight on the mouse in spite of it having a sort of broader feel in hand. It means your grip is really sure with this mouse, which is actually kind of surprising given, again, the nature of the kit this is packaged with. Because of the way the feet are constructed here, it feels like a heavier and therefore slower mouse than maybe it could have been. Really, most of the issue here is just that these feet don't have quite the same kind of rounded edges to them that you would see on a higher end mouse, and the finish on the plastic here really isn't all that great. So again, tempered expectations here. It's a mouse, it works reasonably well. The sensor's also not particularly offensive, so in that regard, it actually works just fine. Probably the most glaring issue with this mouse in terms of construction, however, is the cable. You probably have noticed in the B-roll by now, this cable exits in a really strange place on this mouse. Like, it exits underneath where the scroll wheel is. I'm not really sure what drove that decision, but it honestly makes for a really awkward cable exit for this mouse. And in fact, if you're using some sort of cable bungee with this, you run the risk of having the cable bind on your left or right click for the mouse, which can accidentally hold it down. And especially if you're in the middle of doing some higher end content, especially in a first-person shooter type game, that doesn't end well. As for the rest of the mouse, the left and the right clicks they're fine. They feel nice and snappy, minimal pre-travel. I'm actually kind of impressed with that. Post-travel, after the switches actuate, will vary depending on where on the left and right clicks you position your hand. The closer to the front inside, the more pronounced that post-travel will be, but it's nothing that ended up being super distracting for me in-game. The two thumb buttons here aren't too shabby either. Definitely more of a thocky sound to these than the left and right clicks that we're using up front, but they do feel reasonably crisp, and again, pre-travel and post-travel is nothing super offensive here. I'm actually kind of pleased with how these feel, especially for a mouse that's, again, this inexpensive. Now, we do have a single click button at the top up here, which for some reason it uses glossy plastic. Why did you use glossy plastic there, of all places? But it allows you to select one of the 5 pre-programmed DPI settings for this mouse. That's another thing here. You get no software control, so you only get whatever DPI settings are pre-programmed in here, and I believe it's 500, 1000, 2000, 3000 and 4000 DPI, something like that. You can make it work. I wound up resting on the 1000 DPI setting and then readjusting my sensitivity in games, and I got it to feel more or less the same as my typical 800 DPI setting would. So just keep that in mind if you do end up going with this product. As far as RGB lighting here goes, it's here in the academic sense of the word. You don't have any control over it, and it just cycles through all of the pre-programmed colors. You cannot shut it off, you cannot change its intensity. It's just there, but it's minimally intrusive. You really only get RGB lighting on the scroll wheel and on the little Rosewill pattern on the back, which is covered by your palm anyway. So really not a huge deal there. Speaking of palms, however, the surface finish for the top of this mouse is absolutely a fingerprint and oil magnet. Be sure to keep some kind of microfiber cloth nearby to keep this thing clean. And lastly, the cable itself is braided black. It's nothing especially impressive. It's not a paracord cable or anything like that, but it's not bad. It's reasonably flexible and compliant, and again, if you were to use this with a bungee, it would make the mouse feel just that little bit faster. You just gotta watch how the cable is angled where it's coming out of the mouse, because again, you don't want this binding on your left or right clicks. But now let's focus on the keyboard, because this is admittedly one of the nicer implementations of a membrane keyboard I've seen in a while. Again, relative to its price point. There's nothing spectacular going on with build quality here. It's very obviously cheap plastic. There's very obvious deck flex on this thing when you apply more than even moderate pressure while you're typing, and it is using a standard 104 key layout. I kind of feel like that's a bit of a missed opportunity, because if you're marketing something like this towards a gaming audience like you are, I feel like the TKL form factor is a little bit more friendly, especially if you're dealing with a smaller desk space. It allows you to still keep the mouse and keyboard in a spot where it's more comfortable to game on, but you can do so while taking up less room. That said, if the goal was to buy this for a mixed-use computer that's going to see light gaming and mostly work from home or school from home kind of activities, I could see the numpad making sense, especially if you work with a lot of spreadsheets or word processing and you just like using the numpad for numbers instead of the top row. Sure, I get that then. The keycaps are similarly not anything impressive here. It's just basic painted ABS caps. Done in black, fingerprint magnet, of course. The font is not horribly offensive. It's a little wonky, but it's cleanly legible. Again, nothing super offensive here, but again, you shouldn't expect miracles at this price point. Now, one of the sets of included features that I actually really liked with this keyboard is the inclusion of dedicated media and volume control buttons along the top up here. Yes, the buttons feel super mushy and just really loose in the housing, but they're there and the functionality works. It's kind of great, again, for a keyboard in this price bracket. While we're looking at the top of the keyboard, the included cable does exit out of the center of the keyboard body. It is integrated, it is not braided, it is reasonably flexible, also reasonably long enough. The end. I will also note that while this does have 4 pretty competent feet for the bottom of the keyboard, the little pop-out feet do not have any rubber on them, and the way it angles the case, this thing will very easily slide around on you because of the lack of, again, the rubber coating on the prop feet and the fact that this keyboard is extremely light. Now, as far as the RGB lighting goes here, I'm actually pleasantly surprised with what I'm seeing. It's relatively cleanly diffused as it scrolls across the keyboard. It actually diffuses across what would be considered a mid-plate for the keyboard, but we'll talk about that more in just a second. The controls for RGB lighting are done using a function layer and the F keys across the top of the keyboard. You get some baked-in effects, and they're not bad, if not relatively basic, as well as, of course, this rainbow vomit mode right here. And while you don't get per-key backlighting, you do get zone backlighting. There's a total of 6 individual zones that you can address on this keyboard and change the colors based on a combination of red, green, and blue lighting across a few different steps. It's not super comprehensive color selection, but it is there, and you can get a little creative with the lighting, which, again, doesn't look all that bad at all. The big kicker with this keyboard, which it took me for a whirl at first, is the inclusion of what they're calling a mem-chanical typing interface. Basically, what you've got here is a membrane keyboard that's sitting above the membranes has a sort of housing that's built into the plastic midplate with a stem in the center of it that has a cross-style Cherry MX stem on the top of it. So you can technically use not just these caps, but other Cherry MX compatible caps on this keyboard. But pump the brakes here, because that is not by any stretch of the imagination what you should be doing with this keyboard. This whole kit costs $40. The cap set you would buy would likely cost more than the keyboard, so that's kind of an impractical proposition. But it's still important to note that this is a nice quality of life feature for the keyboard. Because of this cap interface at the top of these stems, it actually makes it very easy to keep this keyboard clean as and when you want to do that, whereas a typical membrane keyboard might not necessarily have that kind of cap interface at the top of it. Now, unfortunately, because of this unique interface and because there are loose tolerance issues with the both of them, it creates something of a rattly typing experience. It's not that any of the switches feel out of place or unsure, but it creates a rattling sound as you're typing. Now, if those tolerances were shored up, this would actually be a relatively clean membrane typing experience. Unfortunately, getting those tolerances much tighter would likely result in a cost increase to this product, and I don't know that's necessarily the right move to make here. Now, that said, typing on this actually really wasn't that bad at all. I mean, membrane keyboards really have come a long way since I first started getting into computers, and if I'm being honest here, these membranes at least have better tactility than MX Browns do. Matter of fact, let's take a listen. Now, one thing you'll notice is I didn't do a stabilizer test on every key that should have had a stabilizer. That's because they didn't have stabilizers. I don't know why, but the delete key and the enter and plus key on the numpad over here just did not have stabilizers in them. Don't know why, but there it is. Thankfully, those keys still feel fine in general use, largely because of the way the cap fits into that stem housing. Now, that said, the stabilizer assembly, while admittedly a little strange, does kind of fit this price point, and it is still at least designed in such a way that if you wanted to, you could apply a little bit of lube to these and maybe shore up a little bit of the rattling there. How much of a difference it would make? Who knows? But you can still technically do it. So $40 for this kit. What do we think about that? Truthfully, you could do a hell of a lot worse than this for $40. I've worked with some really low-end peripherals before, and honestly, the times I've done, I kind of would rather have had this most of the time than any of these other cheap stock Dell peripherals or whatever it is they ship with the computers these days. It's certainly not a perfect solution, and relative to its price point, some of these things sort of make sense to me, but there are some things that just kind of stick out to me as weird little foibles that I have with these products. First of all, why does the mouse cable have to exit the chassis where it does? This is not a great design. It's passable, but I would really like to see a different version of this kit that has a mouse chassis where the cable comes out at the front of the mouse body so you don't have this issue with possibly binding against the left or right clicks. But really, apart from that, the mouse is actually kind of solid. Just move the cable up a bit. Now, as far as the keyboard goes, really the only minor gripes that I had here surround the sort of stem interface here. don't think of this as an opportunity to go out and buy aftermarket caps for this keyboard. Again, you're likely, for a decent cap set, to spend at least as much as this keyboard is worth, if not more than it. Think of it as a quality of life thing to help make the keyboard easier to keep clean because it has an easier interface to work with. You don't even need a cap puller to pull these caps off of the keyboard. And yes, it sounds a little rattly to type on, but honestly, the typing experience still feels really clean. They're using a good set of membranes on this keyboard. So then, am I going to suggest everyone just rush out and buy all of these right now? No, definitely not. If you can afford better, you should absolutely get better, because it'll probably last you even longer than these peripherals will. However, if this is what you have to spend on peripherals, and you really can't flex your budget any more than that, then yes, this is absolutely a kit that I could recommend purchasing. It's all 40 bucks for the keyboard and the mouse. I mean, yeah, not bad, Rosewill. Anyway, toss the video a thumbs up if you like what you saw, and on the way out, make sure you're subscribed and notified so you don't miss any of our content when it goes live. And I'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.